On a Tuesday morning in September of 1992, Frank Donnelly stood at the edge of a swamp and watched his career sink into the mud. 3 days earlier, his company's newest piece of equipment, a Caterpillar 375 excavator, $600,000 of hydraulic power and computerized precision, had broken through what the surveyors promised was solid ground. The machine had dropped like a stone, its 60-ton weight punching through the thin crust of dried earth into the bottomless black muck beneath. Now the excavator sat in the swamp like a wounded dinosaur, buried to its cab, its yellow paint streaked with mud, its tracks completely invisible beneath the surface. Every hour, it seemed to sink another inch. Frank had tried everything. On the first day, he'd brought in 2 Caterpillar D8 bulldozers and chained them to the stuck machine. The bulldozers had pulled until their own tracks started to slip, until the chains groaned and one of them snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The excavator hadn't moved an inch. On the second day, he'd called in a recovery company from Des Moines, specialists in heavy equipment extraction. They'd brought a truck with a 50-ton winch and anchored it to a concrete foundation half a mile away. The winch had screamed, the cable had stretched, and the anchor had ripped out of the ground. The excavator had sunk another 6 inches. On the third day, Frank had rented a crane. The crane operator had taken one look at the swamp, shaken his head, and refused to get within 100 feet of the edge. "That ground won't hold me," he'd said. "You want 2 machines stuck instead of 1? Now Frank stood with his engineers, looking at a piece of equipment worth more than most houses, slowly disappearing into the earth. "What about a helicopter?" one of the engineers suggested. "A sky crane could lift it." "A sky crane costs $15,000 an hour," Frank said, "and the nearest one is in Minnesota. By the time it gets here, that excavator will be underground. We could drain the swamp." "With what? That swamp is fed by an underground spring. We'd need a month and $1 million. Insurance?" Frank laughed bitterly. "Insurance doesn't cover operator error. And according to the fine print, driving into a swamp counts as operator error." The engineers fell silent. They were running out of options, and they knew it. That's when the John Deere tractor pulled up to the edge of the construction site. Let me tell you about Walter Brennan, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Walter was 73 years old and had farmed the same 400 acres in Clayton County for 50 years. His land bordered the construction site, or what would become Highway 52 when Donnelly Construction finished the job. Walter had watched the construction crews arrive 6 months ago, watched them survey and grade and pour concrete, watched them bring in equipment that cost more than his entire farm was worth. He hadn't complained when the noise scared his cattle. He hadn't complained when the construction traffic tore up the county road. He hadn't even complained when the project manager told him he'd need to relocate his fence line because the original survey had been wrong. Walter Brennan wasn't a complainer. He was a watcher. And he'd been watching this stuck excavator for 3 days, waiting to see if the construction company would figure it out. They hadn't. So Walter drove his John Deere to the edge of the site, climbed down, and walked over to where Frank Donnelly stood with his engineers. "Morning," Walter said. Frank barely glanced at him. "Morning. Site's closed to visitors. Insurance liability. I'm not a visitor. I'm your neighbor. Own the land on the other side of that tree line." Walter nodded toward the stuck excavator. "Saw your problem. Thought I might be able to help." Now Frank looked at him, looked at the worn overalls, the mud-caked boots, the 73-year-old face weathered by half a century of Iowa weather. "Help how? I can pull that out." The words hung in the air. The engineers exchanged glances. Someone coughed. Frank Donnelly started to laugh. Let me tell you about that laugh, because it's important to the story. Frank Donnelly was 45 years old and had built Donnelly Construction from nothing. He'd started with one backhoe and a pickup truck, worked 18-hour days for 20 years, and turned himself into the biggest contractor in eastern Iowa. He employed 150 men. He had equipment worth millions. He'd built bridges and highways and shopping centers and schools. Frank Donnelly was not a humble man. Success had taught him that he was smarter than most people, harder working than most people, better than most people. When he looked at Walter Brennan, at the old farmer in his worn clothes with his ancient tractor, he saw everything he'd spent his life proving he wasn't. So he laughed. "You can pull that out," Frank repeated, still laughing. "With what, Grandpa? Your John Deere? That excavator weighs 60 tons. Your tractor weighs, what, 5? "Not with the John Deere," Walter said calmly. "With my steamer." "Your what?" "My steam traction engine. Case 1912 model, 110 horsepower. She's been in my family for 80 years. The laughter spread now. The engineers were chuckling. The workers had stopped what they were doing to listen. Frank wiped his eyes. "A steam tractor. From 1912. You want to pull out my $600,000 excavator with a steam tractor from That's right, buddy. I've got bulldozers that make more horsepower than your whole farm. They couldn't move that excavator an inch. What makes you think some antique is going to do better?" Walter looked at the stuck excavator, then at the bulldozers sitting uselessly at the edge of the swamp, then back at Frank. "Your machines make horsepower," Walter said. "Mine makes torque. There's a difference. Enlighten me." "Horsepower is how fast you can do work. Torque is how much work you can do. Your bulldozers spin fast, but they can't grip. They're designed for pushing dirt on solid ground, not pulling dead weight out of a swamp. My steamer was designed to pull threshing machines through muddy fields all day long. 6-foot drive wheels with steel cleats. Weighs 22 tons herself. She doesn't spin, she grips." Frank shook his head, still smiling. "This is adorable. Really. But I've got a real problem here and I don't have time for—" "You've had 3 days," Walter interrupted quietly. "You've tried bulldozers. You've tried winches. You've tried a crane that wouldn't even get close. You're losing $20,000 a day in delays. You're out of options." He paused, letting that sink in. "I'm not charging you anything. If it doesn't work, you've lost nothing but an hour of your time. If it does work, you can make a donation to the Clayton County Historical Society. They're the ones who helped me restore that engine." Frank looked at Walter for a long moment. Then he looked at his engineers, who shrugged. "Fine," Frank said. "Bring your museum piece. When it falls apart trying to move that excavator, at least it'll give my men something to laugh about. Let me tell you about the steam engine, because it's the real hero of this story." The Case 110 horsepower steam traction engine had been built in Racine, Wisconsin in 1912, the same year the Titanic sank and Woodrow Wilson was elected president. It was a monster of a machine, 22 tons of iron and steel, with rear drive wheels 6 feet in diameter studded with steel cleats designed to grip any surface. The boiler could hold 150 gallons of water and generate enough steam pressure to move mountains. Walter's grandfather, August Brennan, had bought the engine new for $3,200, a fortune in 1912, more than most farms cost. August had used it for 20 years, pulling threshing machines from farm to farm during harvest season, dragging stumps out of fields being cleared for planting, doing the heavy work that horses couldn't handle. When gasoline tractors became common in the 1930s, most farmers scrapped their steamers. The old machines were expensive to operate, slow to start, and required constant attention, but August Brennan couldn't bear to part with his. He'd parked it in a shed behind the barn and covered it with canvas, thinking he might need it again someday. He never did. August died in 1952, and the steam engine sat untouched for another 30 years. Walter had rediscovered it in 1984, when he was cleaning out the old shed to make room for equipment storage. He'd pulled back the canvas and found the engine exactly as his grandfather had left it, rusty, dusty, but intact. Every part was still there. The boiler still held pressure when he tested it. The gears still turned when he cranked them by hand. Walter had spent 3 years restoring the engine. He'd found a retired machinist in Dubuque who remembered working on steamers in his youth. He'd tracked down original parts from collectors and museums across the Midwest. He'd learned to operate the machine from old manuals and older men who still remembered the age of steam. By 1987, the case was running again. Walter took it to county fairs and steam shows, demonstrated it for school groups, kept it in perfect working condition. He fired up the boiler once a month, just to keep everything moving, just to hear the whistle echo across the Iowa flatland. He'd always known the old machine was powerful. He just never had a chance to prove how powerful. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever known you could do something that everyone else said was impossible? Have you ever felt that certainty in your bones, that quiet confidence that comes from understanding something deeply, something the experts with their degrees and their equipment don't understand? Walter Brennan had that feeling as he drove his John Deere back to his farm to get the steam engine. He'd watched the construction crews struggle for 3 days. He'd watched their bulldozers spin uselessly, their winches strain and fail. He'd watched and thought about torque, about traction, about the difference between power and grip. He knew his grandfather's machine could do what their modern equipment couldn't. He just needed the chance to prove it. Let me tell you about the arrival, because that's when the real show began. It took Walter 2 hours to fire up the steam engine. You couldn't just start a steamer like you started a tractor. You had to build a fire, heat the water, let the pressure build slowly until the gauges showed you were ready. Walter had done it hundreds of times, but he never rushed. Steam under pressure was dangerous if you didn't respect